Red and blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror. For most people, they meant nothing more than a routine speeding ticket. But for a black man driving through an affluent suburb with a heavy police presence, those lights could transform an ordinary journey into a nightmare within seconds. When an arrogant and prejudiced patrol officer stopped a quiet, well-dressed driver on a rain-soaked night, he believed he had found an easy target. He threatened the man with years inside a concrete cell, completely unaware that the person wearing the handcuffs was a federal judge. He had just arrested the one man capable of dismantling his entire life. The rain fell in relentless, freezing sheets, turning the asphalt of Interstate 90 into a dark mirror that reflected the taillights of passing vehicles. Inside his meticulously maintained Lexus LS, the Honorable Conrad T. Ellison released a long, exhausted sigh. At 62, Conrad had spent most of his adult life navigating the complicated corridors of the American justice system. He had served for many years as a federal judge on the United States District Court. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence, known for his stoic demeanor, razor-sharp legal mind, and patience forged through countless grueling trials. The day had been particularly exhausting. Conrad had spent hours presiding over a complex corporate misconduct case, working through thousands of pages filled with dense financial language. All he wanted was to return to his quiet home, pour himself a glass of bourbon, and read something that did not require a legal dictionary. However, a major collision on the interstate had forced traffic onto a mandatory detour. His navigation system redirected him through Oakmont Hills, an extremely wealthy and predominantly white community located just beyond the city limits. Oakmont Hills was the kind of town where property taxes were exorbitant, lawns were maintained with surgical precision, and the local police department carried a notorious but rarely acknowledged reputation for aggressively guarding the community's borders. Conrad adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and kept his attention fixed on the road. He remained below the posted speed limit and maintained perfect control of his vehicle. He knew the unwritten rules. He had lived with them throughout his life. A black man driving an expensive car through a neighborhood like Oakmont Hills after dark attracted suspicion. It did not matter that Conrad held a law degree from Harvard. It did not matter that his signature could authorize federal surveillance or send someone to federal prison. Behind the wheel in the darkness, he was reduced to nothing more than a profile. Farther along the tree-lined avenue, an Oakmont Hills police cruiser sat idling in the shadows of an abandoned shopping center. Inside was Officer Brett Callahan. Callahan was 34, with a high and tight haircut and an ego far larger than the badge pinned to his chest. He had spent years building his career through minor drug arrests and aggressive traffic stops. He saw himself as the ultimate gatekeeper of Oakmont Hills, protecting its immaculate streets from people he considered undesirable outsiders drifting in from the city. Callahan often bragged to his fellow officers that he possessed a special instinct for recognizing people who did not belong. As Conrad's Lexus passed the dark parking lot, Callahan narrowed his eyes. The vehicle was clean, perhaps too clean. The windows carried a light factory tint, but the silhouette of the driver remained visible. Callahan leaned forward and recognized the profile of an older black man behind the steering wheel. Immediately, the gears of prejudice began turning inside his mind. An expensive luxury vehicle. A driver from outside the area, a black man whom Callahan's deeply biased worldview told him had no legitimate reason to be traveling through Oakmont Hills late at night. Callahan shifted the cruiser into drive and pulled onto the street, following the Lexus from a short distance. Conrad noticed the headlights immediately. A cold and painfully familiar knot formed in the pit of his stomach. It was a sensation he had not experienced in years, not since he was a young public defender driving through rural southern counties. He checked his speed. Still below the limit. He examined his position within the lane. Perfect. He activated his signal well before making a slow and deliberate right turn onto Maple Drive, a winding residential street that his navigation system indicated would eventually return him to the highway. Callahan followed. "Let's see what you do," he muttered, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. He watched the Lexus carefully, waiting for the smallest possible violation. A tire touching the center line, a signal activated too late. A rolling stop. But Conrad drove flawlessly. Frustrated, Callahan decided that he did not need a legitimate reason. He only needed a pretext. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, he said into the radio. "I'm initiating a traffic stop on a late-model black Lexus sedan with Illinois plates. Suspicious vehicle, possible illegal window tint, and failure to maintain lane." "Copy, Unit 4, the dispatcher replied through a burst of static. Callahan reached upward and activated the emergency lights. The darkness exploded with blinding red and blue flashes. Inside the Lexus, Conrad released a slow and controlled breath. He pulled over immediately, carefully positioning the large vehicle on the shoulder beneath a flickering street lamp. He shifted into park, turned off the engine, and lowered the driver's window. Then, guided by a lifetime of deeply ingrained survival instincts, he placed both hands flat against the top of the steering wheel and waited. Rain pounded heavily against the roof of the Lexus. Through the side mirror, Conrad watched Officer Callahan step from the cruiser. The officer moved slowly, adjusting his duty belt before shining a powerful tactical flashlight directly into the side mirror to blind the driver. He then began a deliberate walk toward the driver's door. As Callahan approached, he unclipped the retention strap securing his service weapon. It was an intimidation tactic, pure and simple. "Evening," Callahan said. His voice was flat, and his tone carried an authority he had done nothing to earn. He kept the flashlight directed into Conrad's eyes, preventing the older man from seeing his face clearly. "Good evening, officer," Conrad replied. His voice was a rich and steady baritone, completely calm and lacking the nervous hesitation most people displayed during a traffic stop. Conrad had faced cartel leaders and corrupt politicians from the bench. The aggressive posturing of a local patrolman seemed almost amateurish by comparison. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Callahan asked. He leaned closer to the open window while his eyes searched aggressively through the spotless interior of the Lexus. "I confess that I do not," Conrad answered smoothly. "I was traveling below the speed limit. My registration is current and my vehicle is in full working order. Perhaps you could explain the reason." Callahan's jaw tightened. He disliked the way Conrad spoke. He disliked his vocabulary, his lack of fear, and his quiet dignity. To a man like Callahan, a citizen's dignity felt like open defiance. "You swerved back there," Callahan lied without hesitation. "Failure to maintain your lane. Your window tint also looks illegally dark. Where are you headed, buddy?" The word buddy hung between them. It was a deliberate act of disrespect intended to diminish Conrad's status. "I am returning home, officer," Conrad replied, choosing to ignore the fabricated violations for the moment. "The interstate was blocked by a collision, and my navigation system directed me through Oakmont Hills. I am simply passing through." "Passing through?" Callahan repeated skeptically. He directed the flashlight into the rear seat, searching for anything he could use to justify further investigation, a bag, a loose package, anything that might support his suspicions. There was nothing except a leather briefcase resting neatly on the passenger seat. "Whose car is this?" "It is my vehicle, officer." "You have a license and registration?" Callahan demanded, his tone becoming harsher. "I do. My license is inside my wallet, which is in the interior pocket on the left side of my jacket. My registration is inside the glove compartment. With your permission, I will retrieve them." Callahan paused. Conrad's careful and procedural manner briefly unsettled him. That discomfort quickly became irritation. "Just get the license. Keep your hands where I can see them." Conrad slowly reached inside his tailored charcoal jacket and removed his wallet. He extracted his driver's license and extended it through the window. Callahan snatched the card away and aimed his flashlight at it. "Conrad Ellison," he read aloud. He looked from the photograph to Conrad's face. "You live in the city. You're a long way from home, Conrad." "As I explained, I was redirected." "Yes, I heard your story," Callahan sneered. "What do you do for work, Connie?" Conrad's eyes narrowed slightly. "Connie." He had tolerated the baseless stop. He had tolerated the lie about swerving. But the officer's descent into blatant disrespect was beginning to test even his legendary patience. Still, Conrad understood the law. The side of the road was not a courtroom. Arguing with a man carrying both a weapon and a badge was a fool's endeavor. "I work in the legal profession, officer," Conrad answered carefully. He had no desire to use his position. He despised the idea of presenting federal credentials merely to escape a traffic stop. Conrad firmly believed that the law should apply equally to everyone, whether the person was a janitor or a federal judge. If this officer intended to harass him, Conrad wanted to experience exactly what any other black man in his position would face without the protective shield of his title. "The legal profession?" Callahan scoffed. "What are you, a paralegal, a clerk?" "I am employed by the federal government." Callahan released a short and bitter laugh. "Right, listen carefully. We've had a series of burglaries in this neighborhood, expensive property, people coming from the city in luxury cars they probably can't afford, looking at houses and planning robberies." "You fit the description." Conrad stared at him. "Officer, I am 62 years old, and I am wearing a custom-tailored suit. Do I appear to be surveying homes for burglary in the middle of a rainstorm?" Don't get smart with me, boy, Callahan snapped. The racial insult was thinly disguised, but its meaning was unmistakable. It struck the air like a physical blow. Conrad's expression became completely cold. The grandfatherly warmth vanished, replaced by the terrifying stillness that usually preceded his most devastating judicial rulings. I strongly advise you to reconsider your tone, officer, Conrad said. His voice dropped lower, radiating an absolute and freezing authority. I also suggest that you verify my license, issue a citation if you genuinely believe I committed a traffic violation, and allow me to continue my journey. You possess no reasonable, articulable suspicion to detain me further. Callahan stepped backward, genuinely startled by the command in Conrad's voice. His surprise quickly transformed into blind anger. Who did this man think he was? In Oakmont Hills, no one addressed Brett Callahan that way, especially not a black man he had stopped in the darkness. Step out of the vehicle, Callahan ordered, placing his hand firmly on the grip of his service weapon. On what legal grounds? Conrad asked calmly, keeping his hands fixed on the steering wheel. Under Pennsylvania versus Mims, you may order a driver to leave a vehicle for officer safety. However, I have been completely compliant and my hands have remained visible. I must therefore ask whether you are issuing a lawful order or merely escalating this encounter because your ego has been offended. Callahan's face turned scarlet. With his free hand, he drew his taser and aimed the red laser at Conrad's chest. I said, get out of the car now, or I will drag you out and charge you with resisting arrest. Conrad looked down at the red dot glowing against his suit. Then he looked at the rage trembling in the officer's eyes. He knew exactly how the situation could end if he refused. He had presided over wrongful death cases. He had watched dashboard footage of men who looked like him dying on wet pavement because an officer's pride had been wounded. I am complying, Conrad said quietly. I am ensuring the engine is off. I am removing my seatbelt. I am opening the door. Conrad stepped into the freezing rain. Cold water immediately soaked through his wool suit, chilling him to the bone. He rose to his full height of 6 feet 2 inches and looked down at Callahan. Even while standing completely still, Conrad possessed an unmistakable air of authority. Turn around, Callahan barked as he moved forward aggressively. Put your hands on the roof. Spread your legs. Conrad slowly turned and placed his palms against the wet roof of the Lexus. He separated his feet. Callahan kicked Conrad's ankles farther apart with unnecessary force, nearly causing the older man to lose his balance on the slippery road. He then began a frantic and aggressive pat-down. Callahan dragged his hands along Conrad's legs, searched his waist, and struck his palms against his chest. He reached into Conrad's pockets and removed his keys, a Mont Blanc fountain pen, and a folded handkerchief, throwing them carelessly onto the rain-covered hood of the police cruiser. Where are the drugs? Callahan hissed near his ear. There are no drugs, Conrad answered, his voice remaining low and steady beneath the storm. There are no weapons and no stolen property. You are conducting an unlawful search under the Fourth Amendment without probable cause or my consent. I don't need your consent, Callahan sneered. He violently pulled Conrad's arms behind his back. The sudden movement strained Conrad's shoulder and sent a wave of searing pain through it. Conrad winced but did not cry out. I'm taking you in, Callahan said, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. You want to pretend you're a lawyer? You can do it from a holding cell. You're under arrest. For what offense? Conrad asked, maintaining his icy composure. Refusing a lawful order and obstructing an investigation. I'll think of a few more charges during the ride. Callahan laughed darkly and removed his steel handcuffs. Click, click. The cold metal closed violently around Conrad's wrists. Callahan tightened the cuffs as far as they would go, intentionally pinching the skin and compressing the nerves beneath it. Conrad gritted his teeth as pain and numbness traveled into his hands. You think you're so intelligent, Callahan taunted. He grabbed the back of Conrad's jacket collar and forced him toward the police cruiser. People like you come into this neighborhood and think you can talk down to me. I deal with garbage like you every day. I'm going to make sure the district attorney destroys you. You're facing felony charges, Connie. That means prison. Let's see how articulate you are after spending years inside a concrete box. Conrad stopped walking. Despite having his hands secured behind him, he planted his feet firmly on the wet asphalt and turned his head until he was looking directly into Callahan's eyes. The expression in the judge's gaze was so piercing and completely devoid of fear that Callahan unconsciously stopped pushing. Officer Callahan, Conrad said quietly, his voice cutting through the rain with terrifying clarity, I want you to remember everything you are doing. I want you to remember every threat you have made and every charge you have fabricated. Because I assure you that before long, the life you currently know will be completely over. Callahan blinked. For a moment, uncertainty passed across his face. Then arrogance consumed it. He shoved Conrad hard against the side of the cruiser. Is that a threat? Callahan shouted. You're threatening the police officer. I'll add that to the charges. Get inside. Callahan opened the rear door and forced Conrad into the vehicle. Because of Conrad's height, his head struck the doorframe as he was pushed downward. He collapsed onto the hard plastic seat, his restrained arms twisted painfully beneath him. The door slammed shut with a deafening metallic impact. Inside the dark and claustrophobic rear compartment, which smelled of disinfectant and stale sweat, Conrad struggled to sit upright. His wrists were bleeding where the steel restraints had cut into the skin. His tailored suit was ruined, and his head throbbed from striking the metal frame. Through the plexiglass partition, he watched Callahan walk back toward the Lexus. The officer removed Conrad's expensive leather briefcase from the passenger seat, tossed it carelessly into the front of the police cruiser, and slammed the door. He did not even secure the Lexus. He left it sitting beside the road with its hazard lights flashing. Callahan entered the driver's seat, dripping with rain, and shifted the cruiser into gear. He looked at Conrad through the rear-view mirror. A smug and victorious smile spread across his face. You're finished, old man, Callahan said. The county jail is waiting. Conrad leaned his head against the hard plastic seat and closed his eyes. The rage inside him burned like a quiet and carefully controlled inferno. He was not merely a man who understood the law. He was a man who commanded it. He had dedicated his life to justice and to ensuring that the enormous power of the state was exercised fairly. Now he sat in the rear of a police vehicle, victimized by the same systemic corruption he confronted from the bench. Conrad said nothing more. He did not shout. He did not beg. He did not reveal his identity. He remained silent in the darkness, allowing the rhythmic movement of the windshield wipers to count down the final moments of Officer Brett Callahan's career. Callahan had no idea what he had done. As the cruiser moved through the rain-soaked streets toward the Oakmont Hills Police Department, the arrogant officer mentally constructed a police report filled with lies. He remained completely unaware of the catastrophic reality. He had not merely arrested an innocent man, he had arrested a sitting federal judge of the United States District Court. Conrad intended to let him continue digging until there was no possible way out. The Oakmont Hills Police Department was a brick and glass fortress built with generous municipal funding. It contained modern holding cells and highly polished granite floors. The precinct was quiet beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting, disturbed only by the hum of vending machines and the occasional chatter of the police radio. When Officer Brett Callahan dragged Conrad Ellison through the heavy double doors, the squeaking of his wet tactical boots broke the silence. Conrad walked with his head held high and his posture perfectly straight, despite his soaked and ruined custom suit and the agonizing pressure of the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. Behind the raised booking desk sat Sergeant Warren Doyle. Doyle was 58, a heavy-set and world-weary veteran who was approaching retirement. He had seen every kind of offender pass through those doors. However, when he looked over his reading glasses, his instincts immediately warned him that something was wrong. The man Callahan was pushing toward the desk did not resemble a burglar. He did not resemble a vagrant or a drug dealer. He looked like the chief executive of a major company who had somehow survived a shipwreck. "What have you brought me, Callahan?" Doyle grunted as he reached for an intake form. "Caught a serious one," Callahan announced loudly enough for the younger officers in the adjoining room to hear. He shoved Conrad roughly against the booking counter. "I found him prowling through the Maple Drive area. He refused a lawful order, resisted arrest, and obstructed my investigation. He was probably examining the neighborhood for a burglary operation. I want him placed in holding while I complete the felony charges." Doyle looked at Conrad. He saw blood running from the man's wrist and mixing with the rainwater. He also saw the calm and unnervingly steady gaze of the person standing before him. "Name?" Doyle asked. "Conrad Ellison," he replied. His deep, composed voice seemed completely out of place in a police booking room. Doyle paused. The name seemed familiar, but he could not immediately remember where he had heard it. "All right, Conrad, turn around. We'll remove the cuffs before the search." Callahan took out his keys with a grin. "Don't let him fool you, Sarge. He likes to talk. Thinks he's some kind of attorney." Callahan unlocked the restraints. Conrad slowly brought his arms forward, wincing as circulation returned to his severely bruised wrists. He did not rub them. Instead, he placed both hands flat against the counter and turned his penetrating gaze toward Doyle. "Sergeant," Conrad said smoothly, "I am formally requesting the preservation of all dashboard camera and body camera footage recorded by Officer Callahan in his vehicle from the beginning of this encounter. Furthermore, I am notifying you that I am being detained without probable cause, and I am requesting access to a telephone so that I may contact legal counsel." Callahan released a loud laugh. "Listen to this man. He thinks he's appearing on television. Empty your pockets, Connie." Conrad ignored him completely and continued looking at Doyle. The sergeant frowned. The precision of Conrad's language was unsettling. Most detainees shouted, cried, or used profanity. They did not issue formal legal preservation requests. Irritated by Conrad's composure, Callahan picked up the wet leather briefcase he had taken from the Lexus and slammed it against the counter. He then threw Conrad's wallet, keys, and fountain pen beside it. "Here's his property," Callahan said. "I'm getting dry clothing from my locker and starting the paperwork. Put him in the second cell. Don't let him make a call until I authorize it." "You know that isn't how this works, Brett," Doyle sighed, rubbing his forehead. "He is entitled to a telephone call." "After booking," Callahan shot back. He turned and swaggered toward the locker room, completely confident that he controlled everything inside the building. Once Doyle was alone with Conrad, he pulled on blue nitrile gloves to begin the required inventory. "Mr. Ellison, I must document your belongings before placing you in a cell. Are there any weapons, needles, or illegal items inside this bag?" "No," Conrad answered quietly. "However, I strongly recommend that you examine the contents of both my wallet and briefcase carefully." Doyle gave him a tired glance. "Of course." He lifted the soaked leather wallet and opened it. He removed the damp driver's license. Conrad T. Ellison. Doyle recorded the name. He found several $100 bills, a platinum credit card, and a health insurance card. Nothing unusual. Then he reached into the rear compartment of the wallet. His fingers touched something heavy and covered in thick, embossed leather. He removed a trifold credential holder. Doyle opened it. The overhead fluorescent light reflected from a solid gold shield. Beneath the shield, sealed inside tamper-resistant government laminate, was an identification card bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. The words were printed in bold, unmistakable letters. "United States District Court. The Honorable Conrad T. Ellison, Article 3 Judge." Doyle stopped breathing. The air inside the booking room seemed to disappear. His eyes moved from the gold shield to the photograph on the card. Then they slowly rose toward the tall and silent black man standing on the opposite side of the counter. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Doyle whispered as all color drained from his face. Conrad did not blink. "If you open the briefcase, Sergeant, you will find the sentencing guidelines for United States versus Vancorp Industries, a multi-million-dollar federal embezzlement case over which I am currently presiding. Those documents have now been unlawfully seized by Officer Callahan." Doyle's hands shook so violently that the credential holder fell onto the counter. Cold sweat formed along the back of his neck. He had spent a long career in law enforcement. He understood the hierarchy of authority. A patrol officer occupied the lowest level. A sitting Article 3 federal judge, appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, possessed enough legal authority to bring an entire police department under federal control with a single injunction. "Your Honor," Doyle stammered, his voice breaking. He tore the gloves from his hands. "Your Honor, I had no idea." "I understand, Sergeant Doyle," Conrad replied softly. "You did not stop my vehicle. You did not assault me. And you did not fabricate criminal charges." "I'm releasing you immediately," Doyle said frantically, reaching for the override keys. "I'll have your vehicle brought here. I'll personally take you home. We can resolve this. This has been a terrible misunderstanding." "Do not touch those keys," Conrad commanded. His voice barely became louder, but the crushing authority behind it froze Doyle in place. "Sir," the sergeant whispered. "I have been formally arrested by an officer employed by this department," Conrad said, cold fury burning behind his eyes. "I have been subjected to an unlawful search, an unconstitutional seizure, and physical assault. I have been threatened with fabricated felony charges intended to intimidate me. If I were any other black man from the city, I would already be locked inside one of those cells, facing the destruction of my life because an arrogant officer intended to commit perjury. I am not leaving." "Judge Ellison, please. If the chief discovers—" "You are going to contact your chief," Conrad interrupted, leaving no room for discussion. "You will tell him to report here immediately. You will not tell Officer Callahan anything until the chief arrives. Do you understand me, Sergeant?" Doyle looked at the federal credentials and then at the bleeding wrists of the most powerful man he had ever encountered. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." Chief of Police Preston Hale was asleep in his large suburban home when his cell phone began vibrating on the nightstand. At 52, Hale was a political survivor. He had spent years managing the wealthy and demanding residents of Oakmont Hills, keeping official crime statistics nearly non-existent and ensuring that his department continued receiving generous funding. He reached for the phone and squinted at the bright screen. The call came from the precinct desk. "Hale," he answered, his voice heavy with sleep. "Chief, this is Sergeant Doyle. You need to come to the precinct immediately." Hale sat upright and rubbed his eyes. Doyle was not a man who panicked easily. "Warren, what happened?" "We have a serious problem." "What kind of problem?" "Callahan brought someone in after a traffic stop on Maple Drive. He charged him with resisting arrest, obstruction, and several other offenses." "And?" Hale sighed as he began reaching for his clothes. "Callahan is aggressive, but why are you calling me over a traffic arrest?" "Chief," Doyle said, pausing as though the words caused him physical pain, "the suspect is Conrad Ellison." Hale froze. The name struck him like a blow to the chest. Preston Hale was not merely a local police officer. Before becoming chief, he had worked as an investigator for the state attorney's office. He knew the major figures within the regional justice system. He knew Conrad Ellison. Ellison was legendary. He was the judge who had fearlessly dismantled the Moretti crime organization. He was the judge who had held federal agents in contempt for lying in support of a warrant. Conrad Ellison was brilliant, uncompromising in his application of the law, and terrifying when someone attempted to deceive his court. "Warren," Hale whispered as blood roared in his ears, "please tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you have arrested a different Conrad Ellison." "Older black man, custom suit. I'm holding his gold Department of Justice credentials, Chief." Callahan handcuffed him and threw him into the cruiser. "His wrists are bleeding." Hale dropped the phone. A wave of profound nausea passed through him. He jumped from the bed without changing out of his sleep shirt, threw on a heavy coat, pushed his bare feet into loafers, and ran toward his vehicle. As he raced from the driveway toward the station, his mind filled with the catastrophic consequences. False arrest, assault under color of law, civil rights violations, a federal lawsuit under Section 1983. The Department of Justice would descend upon Oakmont Hills. The media would seize the story immediately. White suburban officer brutalizes black federal judge. Hale's career would be destroyed. The city could face financial ruin. Back at the precinct, Officer Callahan stood in the break room pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee. He had changed into a dry uniform shirt and appeared extremely pleased with himself. A young officer named Caleb Monroe was warming a container of pasta inside the microwave. "Difficult night?" Monroe asked, glancing at Callahan's wet hair. "Nothing I couldn't handle," Callahan replied with a smirk. He took a drink of coffee. "I just had to put some city trash in his place. The man was driving an expensive Lexus through my patrol area and giving me an attitude. He thought wearing a suit allowed him to talk down to me." "What charges did you give him?" "Failure to maintain lane gave me the reason for the stop," Callahan said with an open laugh, casually admitting that the violation had been a pretext. "Then he refused to leave the car, so I pulled him out. I added resisting arrest and obstruction. I'm speaking to the district attorney about adding felony intimidation. I want him sitting inside the county jail long enough to understand who holds the power here." "That's serious," Monroe said with a nervous chuckle. "You don't hesitate." "You're right, I don't," Callahan replied, raising his chest proudly. "This is our town. People like him need to understand that they cannot simply wander inside and behave as though they own the place." Callahan threw an empty sugar packet into the trash and walked from the break room toward the booking desk. He expected to see Conrad locked inside a cell, humiliated and defeated. Instead, he entered a scene of absolute chaos. The heavy glass doors flew open and crashed against the security stops. Chief Preston Hale stormed inside. His coat hung open, exposing the sleep shirt beneath it. His face was a furious shade of red, and his breathing was heavy. His eyes searched the room until they found the booking area. Judge Conrad Ellison sat calmly on a wooden bench, drinking from a cup of water Sergeant Doyle had provided. He looked up as the chief entered, his expression unreadable. Hale ignored everyone else. He crossed the room quickly and stopped several feet from Conrad. The chief of police, a man accustomed to absolute obedience throughout Oakmont Hills, removed his hat and bowed his head slightly. "Judge Ellison," Hale said. His voice trembled with a mixture of terror and desperate respect. "Your Honor, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. This represents a catastrophic failure by my department." Callahan, who had entered the hallway, suddenly stopped. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered against the polished floor, splashing dark liquid across the granite. "Judge, Your Honor." The words echoed inside Callahan's mind but refused to make sense. He stared at the older black man he had threatened with prison. He remembered Conrad's calm expression. He remembered the warning. Remember everything you were doing? Before long, the life you know will be completely over. Chief, Callahan squeaked, his voice cracking like that of a frightened child. What is happening? Who is this man? Hale slowly turned. The desperate apology vanished from his expression and was replaced by pure hatred directed at Brett Callahan. Close your mouth, Callahan, Hale roared, his voice shaking the station. Do not say another word. Stand against that wall and do not move. Hale turned back toward Conrad, sweat covering his face. Your Honor, I will personally drive you home. Every charge will be withdrawn immediately. There will be no record of this incident. I assure you that Officer Callahan will face serious discipline. He will be suspended without pay while Internal Affairs conducts an investigation. Conrad gently placed the plastic cup on the bench. He slowly stood towering over the police chief. He looked at Hale and then beyond him, meeting the eyes of a pale and trembling Officer Callahan. Chief Hale, Conrad said, his voice echoing through the silent precinct, I do not want an apology. I do not want a discreet ride home. And I certainly do not want an internal investigation conducted in secrecy. Hale swallowed. What do you want, Your Honor? Officer Callahan arrested me under color of law and deprived me of my constitutional rights, Conrad said as he stepped forward. He fabricated evidence, made false statements in his preliminary report, and physically assaulted me. I will not leave this precinct. Instead, you will contact the local federal field office. I want Special Agent in Charge Marcus Vance brought here immediately to begin a federal civil rights investigation. Until he arrives, Officer Callahan's badge and service weapon will be placed on this desk. Conrad's eyes moved back toward Callahan. They were cold and unrelenting, because Officer Callahan is no longer functioning as a police officer. He is a suspect in a federal crime. The silence throughout the station became deafening. It was heavy and suffocating, like the calm center of a hurricane. Chief Hale stood frozen, his face completely drained of color. He looked at Conrad and then at Officer Callahan. Callahan was trembling. The arrogance that had defined his adult life, the badge, the gun, the ability to destroy someone's future without consequence, was disappearing before his eyes. Chief, Callahan pleaded, his voice weak and pathetic. You cannot be serious. He was swerving. He refused a lawful order. Are you really going to accept the word of a suspect over the word of your own officer? Be quiet, Brett, Hale hissed as he moved toward him. The chief's instinct for self-preservation had overwhelmed any loyalty he might once have felt toward his officer. He knew that failure to obey Conrad's instructions could make him part of a conspiracy to conceal a federal crime. Give me your weapon. Remove your duty belt. Now. Chief, please. Do it, Hale roared. The command echoed across the granite floor. Callahan's hands shook violently as he struggled with the buckle of his duty belt. At last it opened. The heavy belt carrying his Glock, taser, handcuffs, and radio fell from his waist and struck the floor with a loud metallic crash. He removed the silver Oakmont Hills badge from his chest. His hand remained suspended briefly before he placed it on the booking counter beside Conrad's gold Department of Justice shield. Go into the interrogation room, Hale ordered, pointing down the hallway. Do not use your telephone. Do not speak to anyone. Callahan walked away like the hollow remains of the tyrant he had been earlier. Hale turned back toward Conrad. Your Honor, I will contact the field office immediately. For a long stretch, the Oakmont Hills Police Department felt like a morgue. Conrad remained patiently seated on the wooden bench. He finally accepted a clean towel from the terrified Officer Monroe and draped it over his wet shoulders. He did not pace. He did not speak. He simply waited, his presence placing enormous pressure on every officer inside the building. Eventually, the glass doors opened and the entire atmosphere of the precinct changed. 4 men in dark suits entered, led by Special Agent in Charge Marcus Vance. Vance was tall and broad-shouldered, with closely cut silver hair and the grim, uncompromising demeanor of a man who had spent years dismantling criminal organizations and prosecuting corrupt public officials. 3 armed federal agents followed behind him, wearing tactical vests marked with bright yellow FBI lettering. Vance ignored the booking counter. His attention immediately settled on Conrad. Deep concern crossed the veteran agent's face. He had worked with Judge Ellison for years, obtaining warrants and testifying in his courtroom. Conrad, Vance said as he extended a hand. Are you all right? I am bruised, Agent Vance, but I am otherwise unharmed. Conrad answered, gripping the man's hand firmly. Thank you for responding. Vance looked down at Conrad's wrists. The deep purple bruises and dried blood where the cuffs had cut into the skin were impossible to overlook. The agent's jaw tightened. He slowly turned toward Chief Hale. Chief Hale, Vance said in a deceptively quiet voice, I am formally taking federal jurisdiction over this precinct. My agents will secure your server room and preserve all digital evidence, including dispatch records, body camera footage, and dashboard camera recordings. Where is the officer responsible? Interrogation room A, Hale answered, swallowing hard. Before you question him, Conrad said smoothly, I believe we should examine the audiovisual record of the traffic stop. Officer Callahan was confident that I had been swerving, resisting arrest, and surveying the neighborhood for burglary. Let us determine what the cameras actually recorded. Hale weakly gestured toward Sergeant Doyle. Warren displayed the footage from Unit 4 on the main screen. Doyle quickly entered commands into the computer and opened the department's server system on the large television mounted above the booking area. I have the dashboard footage, Chief, but Doyle hesitated and clicked repeatedly. Callahan's body camera file is empty. It appears he manually switched it off before leaving the cruiser. A collective gasp moved through the room. Callahan had intentionally disabled his body camera and microphone to prevent the recording of his racial language and fabricated accusations. It was a classic tactic used by a dishonest officer. He turned it off, Hale whispered, covering his face with both hands. He understood exactly how the act would appear to the FBI. It resembled an institutional cover-up. Special Agent Vance smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression. Chief Hale, he said while removing an encrypted tablet from his briefcase, are you familiar with the Department of Justice grant your city recently accepted to upgrade the vehicle fleet? Hale looked up in confusion. Yes, we installed the new Axon fleet systems. Exactly, Vance said, tapping rapidly against the tablet. As part of the federal grant, those systems include an automatic and tamper-resistant redundancy protocol. The moment Officer Callahan activated his emergency lights, the dual microphone system inside the cruiser began recording. It connects with the officer's lapel microphone through Bluetooth. Even when the primary body camera is manually disabled, the vehicle continues capturing raw audio. That recording is uploaded directly to an encrypted federal cloud server. Your local information technology department cannot access, alter, or delete it. Vance turned toward Conrad. With your permission, Your Honor? Proceed, Conrad replied. Vance connected the tablet to the wall-mounted screen. The display flickered before showing a high-definition wide-angle view from the cruiser's dashboard. Rain struck the windshield. The black Lexus was positioned perfectly on the shoulder. Then the audio began. It was crystal clear. Every person in the precinct stood silently as the true events echoed through the room. They heard Conrad's calm, polite, and legally precise responses. Then they heard Callahan's escalating hostility. Don't get smart with me, boy. The racial insult hung in the room like toxic smoke. Chief Hale closed his eyes, visibly sickened. I'm going to make sure the district attorney destroys you. You're facing felony charges. That means prison. Let's see how articulate you are after spending years inside a concrete box. The recording concluded with the thunderous sound of Conrad's head striking the frame of the cruiser door. Agent Vance disconnected the tablet and handed it to one of his agents. Agent Monroe, enter interrogation room A and place Brett Callahan under federal arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law under Title 18 United States Code, Section 242. Read him his Miranda rights, document any statement he makes. If he resists, you are authorized to use appropriate force. 2 federal agents removed their handcuffs and walked down the hallway. Moments later, Callahan's panicked shouting echoed from the rear rooms. I'm a police officer. You cannot do this. Chief, help me. His cries ended abruptly with the heavy sound of his body being forced against a wall. Then came the unmistakable metallic sound of federal handcuffs closing. Click, click. Conrad adjusted his ruined suit jacket. He looked toward Chief Hale, who resembled a condemned man watching the executioner prepare the final mechanism. Chief Hale, Conrad said. There was no anger remaining in his voice, only cold and clinical certainty. You oversee a department where an officer felt completely comfortable disabling his camera, fabricating multiple felony charges, and assaulting a compliant citizen because he believed his badge gave him absolute immunity. I will contact the Attorney General. The Oakmont Hills Police Department will be placed under a federal consent decree. Every arrest made by Officer Callahan throughout his tenure will be audited, and you will answer before a federal grand jury regarding this department's training, supervision, and oversight. Conrad turned toward Vance. Marcus, I am ready to return home. One of my agents has retrieved your keys, Vance replied quietly. Your Lexus will be driven to your residence. You will travel with me. As Conrad walked out of the precinct, the lights of the federal vehicles reflected across the rain-covered pavement. He did not look back. Inside, Brett Callahan was being led away in chains, finally experiencing the terrifying and unavoidable weight of the justice system he had so eagerly weaponized against others. The consequences were catastrophic, immediate, and heavily publicized. The story soon reached major news organizations. Headlines appeared continuously. Racist suburban officer arrests black federal judge. FBI takes control of police precinct. The dashboard audio inevitably reached the media and played across radio stations and television programs throughout the country. Public outrage rose like a tidal wave. Oakmont Hills Mayor Everett Sloan held an emergency press conference beneath harsh camera lights. Visibly sweating, he announced the forced resignation of Chief Preston Hale and publicly welcomed the Department of Justice's civil rights investigation, promising complete transparency. It was a desperate attempt to protect the city from the multi-million-dollar lawsuits that were already beginning to accumulate. However, the most dramatic consequences unfolded months later. Inside the towering mahogany-paneled courtroom of the United States District Court, the same building where Conrad Ellison presided, Brett Callahan faced trial. Without his badge, union protection, or arrogant swagger, Callahan sat at the defense table looking small, pale, and terrified. His expensive defense attorney, Julian Carrington, attempted every available strategy. He argued that the recording had been taken out of context. He claimed that Callahan had felt threatened. He repeatedly requested a plea agreement. The federal prosecutors rejected every offer. Conrad did not preside over the case. He was the prosecution's most important witness. When Conrad entered the witness stand, the courtroom fell into breathless silence. He wore a flawless charcoal gray suit. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his posture was perfectly straight. He described the events of the rain-soaked encounter with clinical precision. He did not exaggerate. He did not need to. The raw truth preserved in the dashboard recording, combined with the dignity of Conrad's testimony, created a devastating portrait of Callahan's conduct. Judge Ellison, the federal prosecutor asked during direct examination, when the defendant threatened to place you inside a concrete cell for years, did you fear for your life? Conrad looked across the courtroom and met Callahan's eyes. Callahan could not maintain the gaze. He stared down at his restrained hands. I did not fear for my life, counselor, Conrad replied, his deep voice carrying easily through the courtroom. I knew who I was, and I understood that the enormous authority of my office would eventually protect me. But what terrified me and what continues to break my heart is the certainty that if I had been a young college student or a father returning home after a late factory shift, I might now be sitting inside a state prison. The defendant's conduct was not an isolated mistake. For him, it was routine. The jury deliberated only briefly. When the verdict was announced, Brett Callahan rose on shaking legs. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault by a peace officer, we find the defendant guilty. Presiding Judge Terrence Holloway, known for imposing severe sentences, looked down at Callahan with undisguised contempt. Mr. Callahan, Judge Holloway said, his voice filling the courtroom, you were entrusted with a badge and a firearm so that you could protect the public. Instead, you transformed them into instruments of terror motivated by your prejudice and a grotesque abuse of authority. You selected the wrong person, and through your actions, you exposed corruption that this court will not tolerate. Judge Holloway struck the gavel. I sentence you to a lengthy term inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, followed by an extended period of supervised release. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Marshals. A strangled sob escaped Callahan's throat as the marshals seized his arms and pulled his hands behind his back. The heavy steel restraints closed around his wrists. Click, click. The sound echoed throughout the courtroom. It was a devastating and poetic reflection of the handcuffs he had once tightened around Conrad Ellison's wrists. Conrad watched from the rear of the gallery as Callahan was led through a side door. His career, freedom, and reputation had been destroyed by his own arrogance. Conrad rose and buttoned his suit jacket. He walked through the heavy oak courtroom doors and stepped into the bright, clear sunlight. He descended the wide marble staircase, acknowledging respectful nods from federal marshals and passing attorneys. Then he entered his repaired and perfectly clean Lexus LS. As the engine started, Conrad looked down at his wrists. The bruises had disappeared long ago. The memory of the cold steel had not. Justice had been served. One dangerous officer had been removed from the streets. But Conrad understood the truth of his profession. There would always be more work waiting. He shifted the Lexus into drive and entered the flow of traffic, prepared to return to the bench and continue the fight. Power, arrogance, and prejudice form a dangerous combination. But as this story proves, no one is above the law, especially when they target the very person entrusted with enforcing it. Officer Callahan believed his badge gave him the right to destroy another man's life. Instead, justice forced him to experience the consequences of his own actions. True authority does not come from a firearm or a badge. It comes from integrity. If this story of justice and ultimate accountability kept you on the edge of your seat, press the like button, share the video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life inspired stories in which the truth fights back. Leave a comment below and tell us what you would have done in Judge Ellison's position. We will see you in the next story.